Basically, it was a very troublesome topic for President Kennedy, civil rights. It was something that the Eisenhower administration had paid little attention to, although they were forced in a couple instances, but they tried to kind of stand off on that particular issue, and that was a criticism that Kennedy had of the Eisenhower administration when they had their debates and those types of things. But the civil rights actually began back in the 1950s. Probably the most visual Supreme Court decision on civil rights was Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. That was a decision that you could no longer segregate schools. Not that everybody followed that Supreme Court decision, but it did declare that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional. You also, I'm sure, heard the courageous stand in Montgomery, Alabama by Rosa Parks. That began really the long fight in America for civil rights. That's where she was arrested for not giving up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and Dr. Martin Luther King, who was a young pastor then, came through and did a bus boycott for almost a year, and he turned out winning that particular fight for civil rights, and that's when he really got his name as the civil rights leader in America. We also, I'm sure, know about the establishment of what they call Jim Crow laws in the United States. Those were laws that discriminated against Negroes in America. Some examples, Negroes being forced to sit at the back of the bus or stand when a seat became available for a white person. Public establishments such as hotels and restaurants banned Negroes. Negroes were forced by law to use separate restrooms and drinking fountains than white people. I have some examples of those I think we talked about. You got, here's a colored entrance only. In other words, if they were going to enter an establishment, they had to enter a certain way. Colored waiting room in the bus stations. Okay, these are original signs, and then this is kind of like the one that telltale. Here's your drinking fountains, colored and white. If you had a chance to watch the movie Hidden Figures, which my seniors are finishing up right now, the big issue in that is this lady was hired to work in an upper level position at NASA, and they had colored restrooms, and so she had to walk up over a mile to get to the restroom, and then the boss didn't pay attention until she was gone one day. He chewed her out. She kind of let her know, let him know what the problem was, and then he went and knocked down the sign that said colored restrooms. Had a coffee pot there, and she took a drink out of the coffee pot, and everybody kind of stared at her, and the next day she had her own with colored on it, and then she went to pour herself a cup of coffee on that, and nobody had made it for her, so she had to make her own. It was just a long story. So that Jim Crow laws often tell a story about segregated motels. If you know anything about the Ernie Davis story, Ernie Davis played for Syracuse in the late 1950s. They were playing for the national championship against the University of Texas at the Cotton Bowl. They arrived at their hotel and they would not let the Negro players stay, so the Negro players had to stay at a different hotel, and you can imagine what that was like. Not exactly the Hilton. Ernie Davis went on to be the most valuable player of the Cotton Bowl game in which Syracuse defeated Texas for the national championship, and he was to receive his most valuable player award at the local country club, and they would not let him in there to accept his award either, and so the whole team boycotted that. Another example's story I like to tell is Vince Lombardi, who coached the Green Bay Packers in the 50s and 60s, once went into a restaurant in the South and asked if they served Negroes there, and the owner looked at him and says, absolutely, how do you want them cooked? And that's the kind of thing that they had to go. So when you coached in those days at professional college ranks, you didn't have to worry about the game. In addition to the game, you had to worry about where you're going to try to find places to house your players and have your players be able to eat. Anybody heard of Ernie Davis? Have you ever heard of Jim Brown? Jim Brown played for the Cleveland Browns, one of the greatest running backs in NFL history.
Isn't there a movie about
it's called The Express. It's very good. It's called The Express. It's a very good movie.
It's a really good movie.
Yeah.
And he died early, right?
He died at 23.
Yeah.
He had leukemia.
Yeah, it's
and died.
a really good movie.
He played for Syracuse and then was drafted by the Cleveland Browns. #1 pick in the draft. The Washington Redskins actually had that pick, and the owner of the Redskins made the comment that he'll start drafting Negroes when the Harlem Globetrotters start drafting whites. And so he traded the selection over to the Cleveland Browns, and they took Ernie Davis, and he never played a minute for him. He ended up getting leukemia and died. He was the first African American ever to win the Heisman Trophy. And when he won the Heisman Trophy, he was summoned up to a suite upstairs where President Kennedy congratulated him. He just happened to be in the area. It's a good story if you're interested in that. The Express is a very good movie. But anyway, because of these Jim Crow laws, in 1957, Dr. Martin Luther King established what we know as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, better known as the SCLC. It was a civil rights organization based in Atlanta, Georgia. I have a picture up here. This is Ralph Abernathy, who we'll talk about at the SCLC headquarters in Atlanta. But that organization was started basically because of the Jim Crow laws. Martin Luther King Jr. established that. He had great help from Robert Abernathy, Fred Shutterworth, Bayard Rustin. And the SCLC was known for many peaceful demonstrations throughout the 1960s. And their demonstrations were to be set up to end segregation across the United States and to end discrimination across the United States. This is kind of an interesting story, and actually I heard this at church, this story, at the Methodist Church. In 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. gave one of his most famous sermons at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. And he had developed many enemies during the Civil Rights Movement, and he strongly believed the only way to deal with your enemies was to love your enemies, not hate them. And so his sermon was entitled Love Your Enemies, which stressed 3 steps on how you love people that hate you. And first thing he said you have to do is you have to look at yourself and ask yourself the question, why do I have enemies? Okay, why do I have them? What have I done? Second thing you have to do is you have to find an element of good in your enemies. And he believed that all people were made in the image of God, and as a result, all people had good in them. That was his thought. And then he also thought that when the opportunity arises to defeat your enemy, refrain from doing so. He stressed in his sermon that there will always be opportunities to pay back your enemies. Instead of payback, choose forgiveness. He also continued this sermon by suggesting ways we can all love our enemies in the area of violence, hate, and love. One, under violence, how you can love your enemy in the area of violence. He stated that someone must dim the lights on violence. He compared it to 2 cars coming at each other, both with their bright lights on. Well, neither driver can see, which could cause a major collision, and somebody has to come to their senses and dim the lights to avoid the collision. So that's what he believed, is that you couldn't, you can't play chicken with violence. Somebody has to take the stand to dim the lights and keep a bad thing from happening. As far as how to love your enemies in the area of hate, Dr. King believed that hate distorts the personality of the hater. If a person hates, the hate changes who you really are. The best advantage, my wife told me I have to quit playing fantasy football. Okay, she told me that a couple times. Because she said, you're just getting awful. You just hate football. You don't like football anymore. You used to watch football and remark on how the plays are, and now you're mad all the time. You hate it because your guy didn't, they drove it all the way to the 1-yard line and they didn't give it to your guy. And then all your guys get hurt. She said, you cannot play fantasy football anymore if you're going to hate the game. And I just always thought that was kind of interesting, because when the minister was talking about this at church, I thought, geez, that's fantasy football for me. So he said again, Dr. King believed that hate distorts the personality of the hater. If a person hates, the hate changes you who you are. As far as loving your enemies in the area of love, he preached that love has transformative power. This is a very special power that transforms an individual into a better person. So everything he did in the civil rights movement was nonviolent and forgiving and trying to love your enemy as best you could without getting into confrontation. That didn't always work for him, especially when young African Americans who got tired of waiting and being beaten started what we know as the Black Power movement, which we'll talk about. The Kennedy administration's stand on civil rights is when President Kennedy took office, he strongly believed that the federal government should pass laws to guarantee equal rights for Negroes. And at this time in history, this was not the consensus of all Americans, especially white Americans. We talked about the fact that the civil rights was a major issue during the campaign of 1960, and then Kennedy had openly criticized the Eisenhower administration during the campaign for not doing enough in that area. And we also, did we talk about, because the kids are right behind you, did we talk about the support that Martin Luther King Sr. provided for Kennedy to win the election? Because Martin Luther King Sr. was for Nixon. Did I tell you this story? He was preaching for Nixon because, ironically, for a man who did not want to be discriminated against, he did not want to see a Catholic president. Okay, and so he spoke on Nixon's behalf until an event happened that probably made the difference in the Kennedy win because it was so close. Just shortly before election day, Martin Luther King Jr. got arrested and thrown into a prison in Atlanta, Georgia. Not in Atlanta, but outside Atlanta. And his family really feared for his life. They figured when he went in there that he was in there for a short jail sentence, that he would not come out. And Kennedy was sitting in his office one day, and Sergeant Shriver, his brother-in-law, said, "You need to call Mrs. King and provide some support and see what you can do to comfort her at this time of her distress." And he didn't really want to do that. I think he saw that a little bit as grandstanding. Finally, Sergeant Shriver just dialed the phone and handed him the phone and said, "Here you go." In the meantime, Bobby Kennedy was working behind the scenes to try to see if he could get Martin Luther King Jr. released from prison. And to make a long story short, with the president's phone call to Coretta Scott King and the fact that Bobby had some favors in Georgia, King was released just before the election, and all of a sudden Martin Luther King Sr. thought that John Kennedy was the greatest thing ever, and persuaded the black vote to go towards Kennedy. So that was a major factor in that particular election. So Kennedy did believe there should be civil rights. Now like I said, he was assassinated before he got a whole lot accomplished, but he did do three things to really improve the civil rights issue during his presidency. First of all, he established what was called the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, probably better known as CEEO. And this organization ensured that businesses or companies that worked for the federal government gave every person, no matter their race, an equal opportunity for employment. He obviously couldn't control people that did not work for the federal government, but those that did would need to follow that policy. There was also a tremendous voting problem in the South, especially the Deep South, where blacks would not go vote for several reasons, including threat. And so what President Kennedy did early in his administration is he directed his brother Bobby Kennedy at the Justice Department to support the efforts of blacks to vote in the Deep South. And as I mentioned, very few blacks were exercising their right to vote because of fear of repercussion and violence. So he did try to get the Justice Department to help blacks to feel safer about voting in the South. And the third thing he did is he made some key appointments in his administration to African Americans. He named a fellow by the name of Carl T. Rowan, who's up on the board up there. He was U.S. Ambassador to Finland. He also appointed a fellow by the name of Andrew Hacker to be Associate Press Secretary under Pierre Salinger, and this name will be familiar. President Kennedy appointed Thurgood Marshall to serve as a judge on the United States Court of Appeals. This obviously was prior to him becoming a Supreme Court justice. So he tried to appoint some African Americans or Negroes in his administration to try to solve that problem. Well, despite that, Kennedy had some really early struggles in the civil rights movement. During the presidency of John F. Kennedy, 7 major events happened in the United States concerning civil rights. The first one was in 1961, and it was known as the Freedom Riders. And the Freedom Riders were both black and white members of the civil rights movement. And in 1961, the Freedom Riders set out for the Deep South to protest and defy these Jim Crow laws, asking for change. The first example of this peaceful protest was when a group of Freedom Riders traveled in Greyhound buses from Birmingham, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. They were doing this to peacefully protest segregation in the bus stations. And when the Freedom Riders arrived in Birmingham to board the Greyhound buses to go to Montgomery, they were beaten and harassed. Despite the violence and injuries that they suffered, the Freedom Riders were determined to carry on their peaceful protest to Montgomery. So after the violence in Birmingham, they had a problem because no bus driver that was employed by the Greyhound Bus Company wanted to drive the bus or take the risk or responsibility to drive these buses after these circumstances. So by law, providing a bus driver was the responsibility of Greyhound, and all passengers had the right to public transportation if they paid for it, which these people did. So President Kennedy turned to his brother, Attorney Robert Kennedy, to get involved, and the Attorney General called the Greyhound Bus Company personally and demanded that they provide drivers for the Freedom Riders. The bus company complied with the Attorney General's request, and drivers were secured. Bobby Kennedy even sent his friend John Siegenthaler, who was a member of the Justice Department staff, to go to Montgomery to observe the Freedom Riders' arrival there. and Bobby wanted Siegenthaler in Montgomery to observe the happenings and report directly back to him in Washington, D.C. Well, when they arrived in Montgomery, the Freedom Riders were greeted by a large mob. As they got off the bus, they were immediately assaulted and beaten with baseball bats and crude clubs. The Freedom Riders were pushed, kicked, and punched repeatedly, and all this violence against this peaceful protest occurred as local police officers and FBI agents just simply looked on. The FBI agents actually were taking notes in their little spiral notebooks. Well, after seeing the situation getting completely out of control, John Siegenthaler himself tried to provide some assistance to the Freedom Riders, and what do you think happened to him? He was pushed into the ground and beaten with clubs and kicked as well. Well, upon hearing the news live on special telephone, because Siegenthaler was talking to Bobby Kennedy on the special phone, and then he saw it getting out of hand. He went, "Oh my gosh," and he got out of his car and left the phone out the hook. Bobby Kennedy kind of heard what was going on and the violence, and he was furious. So he called FBI Director Jfkcr Hoover personally and asked him for an explanation of the actions of FBI agents who were assigned to Montgomery during the event, who just stood and did nothing. Okay, so that was a kind of a negative thing that happened in Kennedy's presidency. The second event occurred in September of 1962 at the University of Mississippi. On September 20th of 1962, James Meredith, who was a black military veteran, believe it or not, was denied admission at the University of Mississippi. Meredith had joined the Air Force immediately after high school. He served his country from 1951 until 1960, and after he was discharged from the Air Force, he attended Jackson State College for 2 years, which was an all-black college in Jackson, Mississippi. After his 2 years of study at Jackson State, he wanted to enroll at the University of Mississippi to complete his degree. And as Meredith attempted to register for classes at Ole Miss, he was personally prevented from registering by Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett. But when news of this action reached the White House, President Kennedy personally called Governor Barnett and ordered him to allow Meredith to register at the university. Governor Barnett first refused, but continued pressure from the Kennedy administration forced him to allow Meredith's enrollment. Well, the enrollment of James Meredith at the University of Mississippi led to violence, including rioting on campus, and the rioting was so serious that President Kennedy was forced to send in approximately 5,000 federal National Guard troops to restore order on campus. And the results of the rioting at the University of Mississippi, 2 people were left dead, 48 National Guard soldiers were injured, 30 United States Marshals suffered gunshot wounds, but James Meredith remained at the college protected by federal troops who escorted him to classes. So that was the second event during the Kennedy administration that he had to deal with. The third event was in April of 1963. It was the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, versus the Birmingham Police. In April of 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference planned a peaceful demonstration in the city of Birmingham, Alabama. The purpose of that demonstration was to try and end segregation in the city. Ironically, at that time in history, segregation was legal in Birmingham and enforced by local authorities there. Dr. King and his followers would then be protesting a legal act looking for change. Well, on April 12, 1963, Dr. King and nearly 50 other protesters led a demonstration on Good Friday in Birmingham, Alabama. Nearly all of the protesters were arrested, including Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, and Fred Shuttleworth. The arrest would be King's 13th and probably the most important of his civil rights career. After his arrest, Dr. King was thrown into solitary confinement. He was initially denied access to his lawyers, was not allowed to contact even his wife. After his arrest, a friend smuggled a copy of the April 12 Birmingham newspaper into his cell, and the newspaper included an editorial written by 8 local Christian and Jewish religious leaders, and the editorial criticized the civil rights demonstrations in Birmingham and Dr. King himself. So isolated in his jail cell in solitary confinement, Dr. King began to work on a response to this editorial that was written by 8 local Christian and Jewish religious leaders criticizing his movement. And without any notes or research materials, Dr. King drafted a passionate defense of his use of nonviolent demonstrations. And Dr. King initially started this letter by jotting notes in the margin of the newspaper itself. Well, later he wrote out his work on scraps of paper he was given by his attorneys once they were allowed to see him, and Dr. King's friend and ally Wyatt Walker began compiling the letter, and eventually Dr. King's response to that editorial was a 21-page, double-spaced journalistic paper in excess of 7,000 words. It would draw inspiration from the likes of St. Augustine, Socrates, Thomas Jefferson, and even Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren. Anybody know what the name of that document was? No, a letter from a Birmingham jail, which was quite a thing. If you want a copy of it, I'll give it to you. But here it is in really small print. And this again was his response to the criticism that he had taken. But this went down as one of the greatest journalistic writings of all times. And he wrote it from his jail cell in Birmingham. His letter began to appear in publications all across the country. And Dr. King eventually used the letter as a basis for a book he wrote, which was released in July of 1964, called Why We Can't Wait. Dr. King was finally released from jail on April 20th, 1963, 4 days after penning the letter. And again, it was President Kennedy that made arrangements for his release from jail. 2 weeks later, on May 3rd, 1963, the SCLC were joined by more than 1,000 black children who left school to join in the demonstrations, and this became known as the famed Children's Crusade of Birmingham. Along with these black school children, an estimated 2,500 people began peaceful demonstrations in Birmingham for integration. So it started out negative, kind of ended positive, but then it got negative again. These protesters, including those 1,000 children, were immediately met by Police Chief Eugene Bull Connor and a force of police officers. These police officers were equipped with some interesting unconventional weapons they used on these protesters: electric cattle prods, snarling dogs, and fire hoses. If you see videos of people being hit, I wouldn't imagine what it would feel